My name is Evan. I am 32 years old. This happened in the summer of 2024, when my two closest friends, Sophia and Dylan, and I set out on a weekend adventure deep into DeSoto National Forest in Mississippi. I had always prided myself on being a rational man, an ex-engineer with a penchant for logic and practical solutions. So, when we decided to take our newly restored vintage RV off the beaten path for a test run, I never imagined that nature's mysteries could upend everything I believed. We had pooled our savings to buy and fix up the old RV, a clunky relic that we'd lovingly polished and tinkered with until it sputtered to life. Our plan was simple: escape the city stress for a few days, reconnect with nature, and see if our retro ride could handle the challenges of off-grid living. Sophia, whose wild curiosity about folklore and the supernatural had always set her apart, was buzzing with excitement. She'd read every local legend about the woods, from vengeful spirits to the restless haints that some Mississippians whispered about. Dylan, quiet and deeply intuitive, had warned us several times before we left that the forest sometimes seemed to carry a mood, a palpable, eerie energy that he couldn't quite explain. I dismissed those concerns as the ramblings of someone who'd grown up hearing old ghost stories, but even I couldn't shake a small nagging doubt as we pulled onto a narrow, winding road toward our destination. The journey itself was uneventful at first. The RV chugged along, and the dense canopy of ancient trees gradually replaced the flat, open roads of the suburbs. By mid-afternoon, we reached a small clearing near a gently babbling creek, a secluded spot that seemed perfect for our makeshift campsite. We parked the RV and set up a modest camp, eager to explore our surroundings and settle into the quiet of the forest. No sooner had dusk begun to fall than we started noticing that things were off. The first hint came from the natural silence that seemed to descend over the clearing. The usual chorus of crickets and the distant chirping of birds died away abruptly, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the occasional creak of an old tree branch. I double-checked the RV's generator, a critical piece of equipment given the remoteness of our location, and noticed it sputtering intermittently. The generator's failure to provide steady power left us with unreliable lighting and a growing sense of vulnerability. I couldn't help but wonder if our troubles were beginning before we'd even settled in. As twilight deepened, tensions between us began to surface. Sophia's eyes shone with a mix of excitement and apprehension as she whispered about the legends of haints, restless, vengeful spirits said to haunt these very woods. "They say these spirits are the souls of those wronged in life," she murmured almost reverently. "They wander, seeking redemption or revenge." I scoffed, trying to remind myself that these were nothing more than old tales meant to scare children. Dylan, however, kept glancing nervously into the darkening forest, his face etched with concern. "There's something about this place," he said softly. "A heaviness I can't shake. I feel watched." I dismissed his worries with a rational explanation, but deep inside I knew that the forest had a way of unsettling even the most logical minds. After we had settled in for the night, I decided to take a short walk around the perimeter of our camp, partly to clear my head and partly to inspect the surroundings. That's when I first noticed something that made my skin crawl. A series of strange symbols carved roughly into the bark of an ancient oak. The marks looked deliberate, almost like protective wards against something malevolent. I recalled snippets of local lore that described such carvings as a means to ward off haints, those malevolent spirits that were said to prey on unsuspecting travelers. I took a few quick photos on my phone, thinking they'd make for an interesting addition to the countless images of nature we'd capture on these trips. But as I backed away, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt as if unseen eyes were following my every move. Returning to the RV, I found the interior unnervingly cold, as if the chill from the forest had seeped into the metal and fabric. Later that night, As we huddled around a weak, flickering campfire trying to ward off the oppressive darkness, the atmosphere grew even more disconcerting. I was half listening to Dylan's soft, anxious mutterings when I distinctly heard measured footsteps circling the RV. At first, I told myself it was just an animal, perhaps a deer or a stray dog drawn to the light, but the sound was too deliberate, too human in its cadence. I caught Sophia's eye. She looked both excited and fearful, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the circle of our firelight. I tried to reassure her, offering logical explanations, but she only whispered, "There's something out there, Evan. I can feel it." Dylan's anxiety deepened as he gripped my arm, his wide eyes reflecting the flickering light and something else, an emotion that I couldn't quite decipher but which hinted at a deep, unspoken terror. Then, as if on cue, I saw a fleeting shadow dart between the trees. It was almost human in shape, but its movements were unnatural, jerky, as if it were struggling to maintain form in the dim light. The shadow passed too quickly for me to discern any details, but its presence confirmed what our nerves had been telling us all along. Something wasn't right. The night dragged on with an agonizing slowness. I lay awake in my bunk, listening to the slow, deliberate thumping of what I assumed were footsteps outside. The generator continued to fail intermittently, plunging us into darkness at the most critical moments. Every time the light flickered back on, I would catch glimpses of something, or someone, moving just beyond the edge of the beam. I remember Dylan's soft, almost inaudible whisper as he sat up beside me. "It's here, Evan. I can feel it." His voice trembled with a mix of fear and something more profound, an intuition honed by years of listening to the silent voices of the forest. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that it was all in our heads, but the dread that had been building in my chest made it hard to muster any words of reassurance. Then the unthinkable happened. In the midst of the oppressive darkness, Sophia stepped out of the RV. I must have dozed off, lulled by the repetitive sounds of nature and the hypnotic crackle of the dying fire. I awoke to see her silhouette outlined against the pale glow of the moon, her figure framed by the trees. She always had an insatiable curiosity, a desire to confront the unknown head-on. I called out softly, "Sophia, be careful." But before I could hear her answer, the air around her seemed to ripple, as if disturbed by an unseen force. In that moment, a shape emerged from the darkness, a shifting, spectral figure that defied rational explanation. Its eyes glowed with a hollow intensity, and its form wavered like smoke caught in a draft. I froze in terror as I watched the entity approach her. I could see the fear in her eyes before it was too late. The creature's approach was deliberate, almost sorrowful, yet undeniably violent in intent. With a guttural sound that echoed through the silent woods, it lunged at Sophia. I tried to reach her, but an unseen force seemed to hold me in place as I watched in horror. I heard a strangled cry, a sound that was half plea, half agony, and then silence. The creature receded as quickly as it had come, melting back into the shadows. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there in stunned silence, my heart pounding so fiercely I feared it might shatter. Dylan's face was ashen, his eyes wide with disbelief. The campfire's weak glow revealed that Sophia was lying motionless on the ground, a crimson stain spreading beneath her, her body contorted in a way that defied natural explanation. The reality of the loss crashed over me like a tidal wave. Sophia's wild curiosity, which had always been both her strength and her flaw, had led her straight into the clutches of something beyond our understanding, a malevolent force drawn from the darkest corners of Mississippi folklore. I recalled the old stories of Haints, those vengeful spirits said to be the souls of those wronged in life, doomed to wander the earth in search of vengeance or redemption. In that terrible moment, I knew we were dealing with one of these entities, a haint that was no longer content with merely haunting us from afar. In the ensuing hours, as we scrambled to make sense of the horror that had unfolded, the RV's troubles only compounded our misery. The generator sputtered and died completely, plunging us into a night that was all the more terrifying in its utter darkness. Dylan and I huddled together inside the RV, our voices low and desperate as we tried to recall every detail of local lore that might offer a way to appease or banish this malevolent presence. Dylan, drawing on his deep intuition and the stories from his rural upbringing, recalled that the strange symbols we had seen earlier, those protective wards carved into the trees, were part of an old tradition meant to repel haints. "They're like a warning," he explained, his voice trembling. "A sign that this land is haunted by a spirit that we need to respect, or perhaps confront." I listened, torn between my ingrained skepticism and the undeniable evidence of the horrors we were facing. As the night wore on, the entity's presence became even more aggressive. I heard its mournful whispers just outside the thin metal walls of our RV, a sound that was both sorrowful and threatening. It circled us like a predator stalking its prey, its cold, unseen breath seeming to seep through the very fabric of our shelter. The rational part of my mind desperately clung to explanations. A trick of the light, a hallucination induced by fear, a natural animal. But every rational thought was drowned out by the reality of what had just happened to Sophia. Dylan and I resolved to do something, anything, to push back against the encroaching terror. With trembling hands, we gathered the few tools we had, a flashlight, some matches, and the few remnants of our scattered supplies. We also collected several pieces of wood that bore the carved symbols we had seen earlier. In a moment of desperate clarity, Dylan recalled an old ritual from the lore he had grown up with. An exorcism of sorts, designed to confront and drive away a haint by invoking the protective powers of these symbols. We moved as quietly as we could in the dim light, our steps echoing on the forest floor as we approached one of the ancient oaks. I felt every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but I knew that we had no other choice. The entity was growing bolder, and if we did nothing, it would only come closer, perhaps even try to breach the fragile barrier between our RV and the forest once again. With the carved wood in hand, Dylan began to mutter the old incantations in a hushed, trembling voice. I couldn't recall the exact words myself, but I trusted him implicitly. The forest seemed to hold its breath as we recited the ancient verses, our voices merging with the rustle of leaves and the soft, almost rhythmic thumping of our hearts. For a brief, excruciating moment, the oppressive presence seemed to pause, as if assessing our audacity. Then, the silence was shattered by a sudden rush of wind and a violent lurch of the ground. The entity's wailing cry pierced the night, a sound so full of agony and malice that it sent shivers racing down my spine. The air around us grew icy, and for a few terrifying seconds I thought we might be swallowed by darkness itself. But as Dylan's voice rose above the din of supernatural fury, something in the wind seemed to relent. The spectral figure that had haunted us receded, its mournful glow fading as it melted back into the shadows of the ancient forest. I don't know how long we remained there, trembling in the eerie half-light of a dying campfire and the uncertain glow of our makeshift ritual. When at last the whispers ceased and the oppressive chill began to lift, Dylan and I returned to the RV. We knew that we were not entirely safe, that the haint might return at any moment, but we had bought ourselves a few hours, maybe even a night, to try and salvage what little we had left. In the bitter light of early morning, with the forest slowly coming back to a semblance of normalcy, we made the heart-wrenching decision to leave. The weight of Sophia's loss was almost unbearable. I sat behind the wheel of the RV, hands still shaking as I tried to coax the sputtering engine back to life. Dylan sat beside me, silent and lost in thought, his eyes haunted by the memory of the spectral figure and the agonized scream that had signaled Sophia's end. We drove slowly out of DeSoto National Forest. Every mile away, a small measure of relief mixed with deep, lingering guilt. The rational part of me wanted to explain it all away as a series of unfortunate coincidences and mechanical failures. But the images of that dark figure, the carved symbols, and the terrified look in Dylan's eyes were seared into my memory. I could still hear the entity's whisper, a mournful echo in the back of my mind, reminding me that some legends are rooted in truths far older and more terrifying than I ever dared imagine. Today, as I recount those events, I find myself grappling with a profound loss, not only of my dear friend Sophia, but also of the certainty I once had in the world around me. The experience shattered my belief in a strictly rational universe, and left me with a deep abiding wariness of the unseen forces that might dwell in the dark recesses of our world. I still drive that old RV from time to time, though I never stray too far into the wilderness. Every so often, when the wind is right and the night is particularly quiet, I swear I can hear a faint, mournful whisper echoing through the trees, a reminder of that fateful night in DeSoto National Forest. I've spent countless nights questioning what happened, scouring local lore, and talking to old-timers who recalled the haunting presence of haints. They spoke of these spirits not as mere phantoms, but as dangerous entities that, when provoked or ignored, could wreak havoc on anyone foolish enough to cross their path. The rational explanations I once clung to have long since crumbled under the weight of my personal encounter with the inexplicable. Now, every time I pass a forest or see a carved symbol on a tree, I am reminded of Sophia's bright, fearless smile and the terrible price she paid for her insatiable curiosity. I know that I will never forget that night. I will carry the memory of it in every cautious glance I cast into the darkness, every hesitant step I take in the wild. And though I have tried to bury the terror deep within, I am forever changed, haunted by the truth that sometimes the old legends are more than just stories, and that in the vast, indifferent wilderness, some spirits remain all too real. The rational part of me still fights to explain away the unexplainable, but I've learned that sometimes survival depends on acknowledging that there are forces in this world that defy logic. And when those forces come calling, even the most skeptical among us must confront the darkness, however terrifying and inexplicable it may be. For me, that night in DeSoto National Forest was the day I learned that some legends demand our respect, and that curiosity, as brilliant as it can be, sometimes comes at a cost too high to bear. My name is Marcus. I am 45 years old. This happened in the late summer of 2024. I had just come off a painful divorce and a crushing job loss that left me questioning everything about my life. Desperate to escape the suffocating confines of my urban existence and burdened by a past I couldn't outrun, I decided to retreat into the Mississippi Delta for a while. I drove my vintage RV, a temperamental relic inherited from a distant relative, down to the banks of the Yazoo River, hoping that the vast, humid wilderness might offer me a measure of solace or even redemption. The Yazoo River flowed slowly past me, bordered by a maze of ancient cypress trees draped in long, ghostly strands of Spanish moss. The air was heavy with humidity, and the murmur of the water mingled with the rustle of leaves in a way that made the world feel both timeless and ominously alive. I parked my RV on a secluded bank, far from any sign of civilization, and set up camp with a tentative optimism. I planned to spend a few days here, journaling my thoughts, reconnecting with nature, and trying to piece together a semblance of inner peace. I quickly discovered that my RV was as much a part of my troubled past as I was. Its engine coughed and sputtered whenever I pushed it too hard. The GPS unit malfunctioned with maddening regularity, and the generator that I'd hoped would be my lifeline in the remote delta kept failing at the most inconvenient times. At first, I blamed these issues on the RV's age and my own lack of mechanical know-how, but as day turned to night, and the isolation of the swamp deepened, it felt as if the very environment was conspiring against me. It was on the first night that I began to notice that something was terribly off. I was sitting in the dim interior of my RV when a low, guttural howl shattered the uneasy quiet. It wasn't the sound of any animal I recognized. No deer, no coyote, nothing that I'd ever heard before. Instead, it was a deep, menacing roar that vibrated in my chest and set my nerves on edge. I forced myself to look out the window and was met with a surreal sight. Faint amber lights flickering on the surface of the Yazoo River, moving with a deliberate, almost playful unpredictability. For a moment, I wondered if these lights were nothing more than reflections from my dying generator or perhaps bioluminescent insects caught in the humid air. But as I watched, they seemed to shift independently, as if beckoning me deeper into the swamp. The following morning, still reeling from a night that felt more like a nightmare than a mere inconvenience, I ventured out on foot. I needed to understand the signs the swamp was offering, however cryptic they might be. As I walked along the muddy bank near my RV, I discovered deep, ragged claw marks gouged into the soft earth. They were too deliberate, too large for any ordinary animal, and their very presence sent a shiver down my spine. Nearby, torn scraps of fabric, frayed and damp, were entangled in the gnarled roots of ancient cypress trees. I couldn't help but wonder if these were remnants of previous victims, or perhaps the result of some unknown, violent force that had roamed these lands long before me. The isolation of the swamp began to echo the isolation I felt within myself. Each night, as the temperature dropped and the oppressive humidity gave way to a bone-chilling cold, I lay awake listening to the endless chorus of unsettling sounds. The rhythmic drip of rain, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush, and, most disturbingly, the occasional echo of a deep, resonant howl that made my heart pound in my ears. In those moments, I felt as if the darkness outside was a living thing, closing in around me, a mirror for the turmoil within. One afternoon, driven by equal parts fear and a desperate need for answers, I set out to explore further along the riverbank. I had heard murmurs of an abandoned roadhouse, a relic from a time when the Delta was a bustling haven of life and commerce. After hours of hacking through thick undergrowth and wading through shallow, murky water, I stumbled upon it. The roadhouse was a decaying shell of wood and rusted metal, overtaken by nature's relentless reclaiming force. Inside, amid broken furniture and scattered debris, I found a tattered journal tucked into a corner behind a fallen shelf. The journal belonged to a local resident whose handwriting was shaky with both age and fear. As I read the entries by the weak light of my flashlight, I discovered that it recounted the legend of the Bayou Beast, a monstrous creature said to be born of a terrible curse. According to the journal, the Bayou Beast was once a man who had committed unspeakable wrongs, condemned to roam the swamp and transform under the full moon into a creature both man and wolf. The beast was described as having matted, shaggy fur, a face twisted in a perpetual snarl, and eyes that burned with an eerie amber glow, much like the lights I'd seen on the river. The writer claimed that the creature terrorized the Delta, preying on any soul foolish enough to trespass on its territory. More chilling still were the journal's references to an old ritual, a desperate offering meant to either appease or repel the cursed creature. The instructions were vague, a jumble of folklore and fevered superstition, but they mentioned the use of small tokens, candles, and certain wild herbs native to the Delta. I couldn't shake the feeling that the journal had found its way to me for a reason, as if the secrets it held were destined to become part of my own struggle for redemption. With no one left to turn to and no rational explanation for the growing terror I felt each night, I began to prepare as best I could. I scavenged the roadhouse for anything that matched the journal's descriptions. Old, weathered tokens that might have once been used in a folk ritual, a few candles that still managed to hold a flame despite the decay around them, and bundles of wild herbs with an earthy, pungent scent. I didn't fully understand the ritual, but the instructions promised that, if performed correctly, it might drive back the beast. It was a desperate gamble, but I had nothing left to lose. The nights grew darker and more oppressive. My RV's generator continued to fail at the most crucial moments, plunging me into an almost total blackout while the storm clouds gathered above the swamp. The howls returned, louder and more frequent, and I began to sense a presence outside, a heavy, deliberate force stalking my every move. I could feel it before I saw it, a palpable, primal hunger that made my skin crawl. Shadows moved with unnatural purpose at the edge of my vision, and the soft murmur of the swamp seemed to whisper my name in a language older than time. Then, on one storm-lashed night, the inevitable happened. As lightning split the sky and torrential rain pounded the roof of my RV, I heard a roar so deep and resonant that it shook the very ground beneath me. In a flash of brilliant, terrifying light, I caught sight of the bayou beast. It was larger than anything I could have imagined. A hulking, sinewy figure with matted, filthy fur, and a face contorted in perpetual fury and sorrow. Its eyes glowed a fearsome amber, reflecting the lightning's flash, and for a long, agonizing moment, it stood motionless, as if gauging my worth. Then it attacked. The beast charged, its massive form crashing into the side of my RV with a force that rattled the very bones of the structure. Metal groaned and sparks flew as the creature's claws slashed at the weakened exterior. My heart hammered in my chest as I fumbled for the small tokens, candles, and herbs I had prepared. With trembling fingers and a mind racing between terror and a desperate hope, I set up the ritual circle around the RV, placing the tokens and herbs in the pattern described in the journal. I lit the candles one by one, their small flames flickering valiantly against the overwhelming darkness and storm. I began to recite the incantations written in the journal, my voice barely audible over the cacophony of the storm and the creature's furious roars. I cannot say whether my words had any real power, or if they were merely the desperate mutterings of a broken man clinging to a sliver of hope. For a moment, amid the chaos, the beast hesitated. Its eyes locked onto mine, and in that brief exchange, I saw something almost human, a deep, agonizing sadness that mingled with its rage. It was as if the creature was trapped between two worlds, cursed to be both predator and prisoner. The assault resumed with renewed ferocity. The bayou beast circled my RV again, testing the makeshift barrier I had conjured. Each time it lunged, I repeated the incantation, my voice growing steadier even as my hands shook uncontrollably. The storm raged around us, the rain washing over everything in a torrential downpour, and the world seemed to narrow to that singular, terrible confrontation between man and myth. For what felt like hours, I struggled against the relentless force of the beast. Every time I thought the creature might relent, a new roar would cut through the darkness, and I'd see its hulking silhouette looming just beyond the edge of the feeble light. The The sound of its claws scraping against the RV was a constant, dreadful reminder that my fragile sanctuary was nothing more than a temporary shield against an ancient, malevolent force. At last, as dawn began to break and the storm's fury ebbed into a melancholic drizzle, the beast's roars subsided to a low, mournful growl. The oppressive tension in the air eased ever so slightly, and I dared to step outside the relative safety of my RV. The world was a disordered tableau of broken branches, scattered tokens, and deep claw marks marring the muddy bank. The blood, dark, viscous, and unmistakably real, spattered the earth in disturbing patterns, telling a silent tale of violence and loss. I knew then that I could not remain in that cursed place. With a heavy heart and a mind still reeling from the night's terror, I gathered what little I had left and returned to my RV. The engine protested with a series of sputters before finally coming to life, and I drove away from the Yazoo River, leaving behind the dark, twisted beauty of the Delta and the lingering specter of the Bayou Beast. I have since learned that the swamp and its legends are as much a part of its landscape as the cypress trees and meandering waterways. The Bayou Beast, a creature born of ancient curses and human sins, remains a terrifying possibility in the deep recesses of the Delta. I often wonder if it still roams those misty banks, a solitary sentinel of lost redemption, or if it was driven away that stormy night only to lie in wait for the next unwary soul. My journey through the swamp forced me to confront not only the literal horror of a creature from myth, but also the inner demons that had haunted me for so long. In the midst of isolation and despair, I found a desperate strength, a willingness to face the darkness both outside and within myself. Though the scars of that night remain, I now carry them as a reminder that redemption is never free, and that sometimes survival depends on embracing the inexplicable. Even now, as I travel in my old RV on quieter roads far from the Yazoo, I keep that tattered journal and the small tokens from the roadhouse close at hand. They serve as a reminder of the night I stared into the eyes of a cursed beast and, in doing so, was forced to reckon with my own haunted past. I have learned that isolation can be both a refuge and a prison, and that in the wild, untamed corners of the world, the line between myth and reality is perilously thin. I will never forget the howl of the storm, the flash of lightning that revealed the Bayou Beast, or the desperate words I whispered in that final, fateful ritual. I am Marcus, and I survived the shadows of the swamp. Forever changed, I now understand that sometimes the darkest legends are born not from the imagination, but from truths too terrible to face, truths that reside in the depths of both the wild Delta and the human soul. My name is Cassandra. I am 34 years old. This happened in the early autumn of 2024, when I fled the chaos of my recent divorce and a painful personal crisis to seek solace, and perhaps inspiration, in an abandoned town near Oxford, Mississippi. I had long hoped that retreating into solitude might help me uncover the buried truths of my past and spark the creative fire needed for my next novel. I loaded my vintage RV, a temperamental relic I'd inherited from a distant relative, packed a few essentials, and hit the road, desperate to leave behind the relentless noise of everyday life. Driving along narrow, dusty roads, I soon reached a forgotten town whose once proud buildings had crumbled into decay. The streets lay silent and overgrown, and nature had begun reclaiming every corner. I parked my RV in a clearing at the edge of an ancient grove of cottonwood trees. Their broad, twisted trunks and drooping, silver-green leaves gave the place an eerie majesty, as if the trees themselves were keeping long-held secrets of the past. The cool air carried a faint mist, and as twilight descended, the entire landscape seemed to pulse with a quiet, unspoken history. At first, the isolation felt liberating. I set up my small camp, arranged my writing supplies, and attempted to focus on my craft. Yet, even in the relative safety of my RV, the old machine proved as unreliable as the circumstances that had driven me here. Its engine coughed and sputtered when I needed it most, the GPS refused to cooperate, and intermittent power outages plunged me into darkness at odd hours. I tried to rationalize these troubles as quirks of an aging vehicle, but it wasn't long before something else began to disturb the stillness. On my first night, as I sat by the feeble glow of a battery-powered lamp, I was startled by a distant, soft drumming. It was not the mechanical clatter of my failing generator or the patter of rain. It was a deliberate, rhythmic beat echoing from deep within the Cottonwood grove. The sound was low and steady, as if the land itself had a pulse. I told myself it was just the wind shifting the branches, or perhaps a trick of my fatigued mind. But as the hours passed, the drumming grew louder and more insistent, a hypnotic cadence that made my skin crawl. The next morning, driven by both curiosity and an inexplicable sense of foreboding, I decided to explore the decaying town. Wandering along cracked sidewalks and through doorways of abandoned storefronts, I encountered remnants of lives once lived. A rusted sign here, a broken window there. In one dilapidated building, hidden beneath layers of dust and neglect, I discovered a brittle, time-worn diary. Its entries spoke of a ritual performed by early settlers. A desperate act intended to secure prosperity, but which instead unleashed a curse upon the land. The scribbled lines mentioned a sacrifice, symbols carved into walls and trees, and a fate sealed by a bargain made in darkness. A chill ran through me as I read, for somewhere between the fevered words and cryptic illustrations, I began to suspect that my own family might have been entangled in that ancient pact. Later that day, while walking near the grove, I noticed something else. Faint carvings on the bark of the cottonwood trees. The markings were deliberate, a series of ritualistic symbols that echoed those in the diary. They did not appear to be random vandalism, but rather the remnants of an old rite meant to either bind or repel a force beyond human understanding. My rational mind urged me to dismiss it as mere superstition, yet deep down, a part of me knew that I had stumbled upon something real and dangerous. That evening, as dusk bled into night and the fog thickened, I returned to my RV with a mounting sense of dread. As I sat by the small window, I thought I saw a figure moving among the trees, a fleeting glimpse of a woman in antiquated clothing, her form ethereal against the shifting fog. I blinked, and she was gone. My pulse quickened as the rhythmic drumming began anew, accompanied now by soft whispers carried on the wind. Every gust seemed to murmur secrets of an age long past. Over the next several days, the oppressive atmosphere grew heavier. Mechanical failures in my RV forced me to remain isolated far longer than I had planned. And every night the drumming persisted. At times, I would find objects moved from their places inside the RV, as if unseen hands had rummaged through my few belongings. I discovered that cold drafts would suddenly sweep through the cabin, and I often awoke to the faint sound of footsteps just beyond the door. The veil between what I understood as reality and something far more sinister was thinning. Desperate for answers, I returned to the diary and combed through the faded pages with a newfound urgency. I learned that the ritual described had been performed by settlers who had sought to harness a mysterious power in exchange for prosperity, but that something had gone horribly wrong. The ritual, it seemed, was meant to bind a supernatural force to the land, yet its failure had cursed the descendants of those who dared invoke it. The entries hinted that this curse manifested as a restless spirit, an entity known only as the Cottonwood Shade. I began to notice its presence in subtle ways. At the edge of the grove, between the twisting trunks of the cottonwoods, A shifting mass of shadow would occasionally appear, a vague, almost imperceptible form that seemed to blend with the fog. It was never fully visible, yet I felt its eyes upon me in those moments of fleeting contact. The drumming, now accompanied by the rustle of unseen movement, seemed to be a summons, drawing me ever deeper into the mystery. One moonless night, with a storm threatening on the horizon, I could no longer ignore the call of that presence. Clad in a heavy sweater against the cool night air, I left the relative safety of my RV and ventured into the grove. The cottonwoods loomed overhead like silent guardians, their branches reaching out as if to warn me away. But driven by a mix of dread and an inexplicable need to confront the truth, I pressed on. In the heart of the grove, where the fog was thickest and the drumming had become a near-deafening pulse, I finally saw it clearly. The cottonwood shade. It was a shifting mass of darkness and mist, vaguely humanoid, yet perpetually in flux. I couldn't discern its features. It was as if it were made entirely of the very fog that swirled around me. For a long, excruciating moment, I stood transfixed, my heart pounding in my ears as I gazed into what I felt were its eyes, voids that seemed to pull at my very soul. In that silent standoff, something extraordinary happened. Visions began to invade my mind, fleeting images of a past I had never known, a tapestry of sorrow, ritual, and lost hope. I saw faces I recognized only in family photographs and heard whispers of promises and curses passed down through generations. I sensed that I was not merely a visitor in this forsaken place, but that I was inextricably linked to its tragic history. The realization was both terrifying and strangely compelling. In the days that followed, the shade's influence became undeniable. Even within the cramped confines of my RV, I could feel its presence as a weight pressing on my chest. Objects would inexplicably shift, and the temperature would drop suddenly, as if an icy hand had brushed against my skin. Every creak of the old vehicle now carried with it the possibility of an unseen observer. My nights were plagued by the incessant drumming and the occasional fleeting appearance of the spectral woman I had first seen. Her sorrowful gaze a mirror of the anguish I now felt deep within. Haunted by these occurrences, and driven by the need to free myself from the encroaching curse, I turned back to the diary. There, in a series of desperate scrawls, I found mention of a counter-ritual, a way to sever the dark ties that bound the curse to the land and, possibly, to my own bloodline. The instructions were vague and archaic, calling for a collection of tokens, candles, and wild herbs native to this very region. I scavenged what I could from the remnants of the abandoned town. A few weathered trinkets from an old general store, candles salvaged from a decaying storefront, and bundles of herbs growing wild near the cottonwoods. On the night the storm finally broke, with dark clouds obscuring the moon and rain beginning to pelt the earth, I prepared to perform the ritual. I chose a clearing at the base of one of the largest cottonwood trees, its bark already marked with the ancient symbols that I had seen throughout the town. With trembling hands, I arranged the tokens, candles, and herbs in the precise pattern described in the diary. The rhythmic drumming started almost immediately, as if the land itself was acknowledging my challenge. I began the incantation, my voice soft at first, and then gradually growing in strength as the words, though archaic, seemed to resonate with an inherent power. The air turned frigid, and the fog coalesced around me in swirling tendrils. As I neared the end of the ritual, I felt a presence intensify. Out of the shifting mists, the cottonwood shade emerged with startling clarity. No longer a vague, elusive form, it now loomed before me as a defined, albeit still spectral, figure. Its presence was overwhelming, a blend of sorrow, anger, and an ancient, mournful wisdom. For what seemed like an eternity, I stood there, locked in silent communion with the shade. In its formless gaze, I perceived a story of generations of despair, a covenant made in desperation, a promise unfulfilled, and a curse that had seeped into the very soil of this land. I continued my incantation, pouring every ounce of hope and fear into those desperate words. The drumming swelled, echoing in the cavern of my mind like the beat of a long-dead heart, and the wind screamed around me as if the very elements were warring in response. Then, in a final, shattering moment, the cottonwood shade began to dissolve. Its form unraveled into countless wisps of fog that drifted away into the stormy night. I felt a sudden release, as though the weight of centuries had lifted from my soul, even as a lingering chill told me that some remnants of that dark past might never fully vanish. When the storm subsided and the first hesitant rays of dawn pierced the dissipating fog, I returned to my RV. The abandoned town was as silent and forlorn as ever, yet something had changed inside me. I wasn't sure if the curse had been broken or merely lay dormant once again, but I sensed that I had confronted a legacy that was as much a part of me as the blood in my veins. Now, even as I sit here writing these words in the relative safety of a restored routine, I cannot forget the haunting lessons of that autumn. Every time I pass by a cottonwood grove or hear the distant, inexplicable echo of a drum, I am reminded that the past is never truly dead. It lingers in the shadows, woven into the fabric of our lives, waiting for the moment when we dare to look into its eyes. I have learned that some secrets are too heavy to ignore, and sometimes the only way to move forward is to face the ghosts of our ancestry, no matter how painful or mysterious they may be. My retreat to that desolate town was meant to be an escape from the chaos of my present, but it turned out to be a journey into the heart of my own legacy. A legacy that, for better or for worse, I now carry with me wherever I go. My name is Cassandra, and I survived the night of the cottonwood shade. Whether the curse is truly broken or lies waiting in the darkness, I know that my life will never be the same. I continue to write, to search for answers in the echoes of the past, and to honor the memory of those lost souls whose sorrow still whispers among the cottonwoods. And as I forge ahead into an uncertain future, I do so with the understanding that sometimes the line between myth and reality is perilously thin, and that facing that line head-on may be the only path to redemption. My name is Ryan. I am 28 years old. This happened in the late fall of 2024, when I was desperate to escape the crushing weight of my past. A past filled with a broken relationship, a collapsed career, and a mistake that has haunted me for years. I loaded up my aging RV, a relic that had seen better days and had never quite earned my trust, and set off for the pine forest near Corinth, Mississippi. I needed solitude, a place far removed from the memories that continually reminded me of my failures, and perhaps a chance at redemption. The drive was long and lonesome. The autumn wind whipped through the tall pines, their skeletal branches stripped bare by the season's harshness. I found a clearing near an old, crumbling monument, a forgotten memorial dedicated to a soldier lost during the Civil War. The monument itself was a relic of another time, its once proud inscription now faded and nearly illegible. I parked my RV nearby, its engine coughing intermittently as if protesting the journey, and began to set up camp. The isolation was immediate and profound. It was as if the forest, with its relentless wind and driving rain, was determined to swallow me whole. I had hoped that the solitude would help me sort through the jumble of regret and self-doubt that had consumed me. Instead, the first night brought its own kind of torment. Around midnight, as I sat inside the RV trying to warm myself with a weak, flickering lamp, I began to hear something that wasn't the normal creak of an old vehicle, or the howl of the wind. It was a deep, resonant clanging, a metallic sound that echoed like the measured march of unseen footsteps. At first, I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the wind or the groans of my temperamental RV, but the sound persisted, growing steadily louder, as if it were drawing nearer. The following evening, while working outside on a minor repair, trying to coax the engine into some semblance of reliability, I caught sight of something in the periphery of my vision. In the dim light of dusk, among the towering pines, I saw a tall, shadowy figure moving slowly between the trees. The figure was unmistakably human in shape, yet there was something otherworldly about it. As I strained my eyes, I noticed that the person was clad in what looked like a tattered military uniform, its surface mottled with rust and decay. The figure was wearing a dented helmet that obscured its face, and its eyes, if they could be called that, glimmered with a sorrowful, eerie light. Before I could fully comprehend what I was seeing, the figure melted away into the darkness, leaving me with a chill that seeped deep into my bones. Disturbed, I wandered over to the old monument the next day. The ground around it was littered with remnants of personal effects: a rusted locket, a battered pocket watch, and faded inscriptions that hinted at a tragic story. I pressed my hand against the cold metal of the monument, feeling as though I were coming into contact with a piece of history laden with unspoken regrets. An inscription, almost eroded beyond recognition, spoke of a soldier condemned to wander these lands after a fatal mistake on the battlefield, a mistake that not only cost him his life, but left him burdened with unending remorse. The words, though fragmented, resonated with something deep inside me. For reasons I couldn't fully explain, I felt an inexplicable kinship with this long-dead soldier, as if his story mirrored my own inner torment. As night fell over the forest in the following days, the eerie phenomena escalated. My RV's electrical system began to fail more frequently, plunging me into sporadic darkness punctuated by the intermittent, eerie clanging I'd grown to dread. At times, I would wake up to discover personal items inexplicably moved from their usual places, and on more than one occasion, I experienced sudden drafts of cold air that swept through the cramped interior of the RV. In those moments, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone, that something unseen was observing my every move. Tormented by both the relentless weather and the supernatural occurrences, I turned to local history for solace. I spent hours in a small-town library when I could get reliable internet, poring over old records and newspaper clippings about Corinth and its surrounding areas. I discovered that the region had seen its share of tragedy during the Civil War, a battle so fierce and fraught with error that many local legends were born from its ashes. Among these stories was that of a soldier known as the Rusted Sentinel. According to local lore, this man had made a catastrophic error on the battlefield that cost not only his life, but also the lives of several comrades. His punishment, it was said, was eternal unrest. He was doomed to wander the pine forests, forever searching for a way to atone for his mistake. Each time I read these accounts, my internal guilt and regret deepened. I couldn't help but see parallels between his story and my own. A past mistake, a life marred by regret, and the desperate longing for redemption. It was as if the Rusted Sentinel's wandering spirit had been waiting for someone like me, a fellow soul burdened with remorse, to acknowledge his suffering and, perhaps, help him find peace. Night after night, the spectral soldier's presence became increasingly apparent. I began to experience vivid nightmares filled with the sounds of clashing steel, the anguished cries of dying men, and disembodied military commands echoing in the howling wind. In the waking hours, I would find myself inexplicably drawn to the edge of the forest, as if some invisible force was guiding me toward a destination I was meant to confront. Objects inside the RV, a pen here, a notebook there, would vanish only to reappear in odd places, almost as if the rusted sentinel himself were leaving clues, guiding me deeper into his tragic history. Then, on one particularly stormy night, when the rain pounded the earth with relentless fury and the wind howled like the voices of the damned, I felt a compulsion I could no longer ignore. I gathered my notebook, a few candles, and the remnants of my scant belongings, and stepped out into the tempest. The RV's lights flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows across the drenched forest floor. I followed the sound of that relentless clanging, a sound that now seemed more like a summons than a threat, until I reached a secluded clearing deep in the forest. There, nestled beneath overgrown brush and tangled roots, lay a crumbling memorial that bore the scars of time. Its surface was etched with weathered inscriptions, and the air around it was heavy with a palpable sorrow. In the center of the clearing, partially concealed by debris, I discovered a rusted box. My hands trembled as I pried it open, revealing its contents. Among them were the very relics I had seen scattered near the monument: a rusted locket and a battered pocket watch, and a fragment of a journal. The journal fragment was a hastily scrawled account of a final regret, detailing the soldier's remorse and the wish that his lost honor might be restored through a simple act of restitution. The words resonated with a clarity that sent shivers down my spine. It was as though the spirit of the rusted sentinel had reached out through the decades to implore someone, anyone, to help him find closure. In that charged moment, as the storm raged around me and the relentless clanging of metal filled the air, I felt my own inner turmoil come to a head. I knelt by the memorial, clutching the relics tightly, and spoke aloud my own confession. A torrent of regrets, of mistakes made and chances lost. I acknowledged the burden I had carried for so long, and in doing so I vowed to honor the memory of the soldier whose suffering had somehow mirrored my own. My voice, though shaking, carried across the clearing, mingling with the patter of rain and the mournful whisper of the wind. As I finished speaking, the atmosphere shifted. The oppressive chill that had haunted me all night began to lift, and for a brief, transcendent moment, I felt a profound sense of relief, as if a weight I had borne for years was finally being lifted. Then, emerging from the swirling rain and shadows, I saw him one final time. The rusted sentinel stood before me, his spectral form illuminated by the occasional flash of lightning. His eyes, hidden beneath the dented helmet, shone with a sorrow so deep that I felt it pierce my soul. For a few long, suspended seconds we regarded each other in silence, a meeting of two tortured souls bound by the shared burden of regret. Without a word, I placed the rusted locket and the journal fragment at the base of the memorial, as if returning them to their rightful resting place. The soldier's gaze softened, and his form began to shimmer with a gentle, sorrowful glow. Slowly, as though carried away by the very wind that had borne the voices of the past, the rusted sentinel began to dissolve into the darkness. The last thing I saw was the faint outline of his uniform, fading like the remnants of a long-forgotten dream, before he vanished completely, leaving behind a silence that felt almost sacred. In the aftermath of that night, the storms eventually subsided, and the forest fell into a heavy, reflective quiet. I returned to my RV, feeling as if I'd crossed a threshold, a passage from despair into a tentative hope of redemption. The supernatural occurrences lessened, and the oppressive presence that had haunted me for so long seemed to recede into the shadows of memory. I kept the relics safely in my notebook as a reminder of what had transpired, a testament to the idea that sometimes the ghosts we face are not just specters from the past, but reflections of our own inner demons. Driving away from the forest the next day, I felt an unfamiliar lightness in my heart. I knew that the scars of my past would not vanish overnight, but in that storm-lashed clearing, I had taken the first step toward forgiving myself. I had confronted a ghost, a haunted soul condemned to wander in eternal regret, and in doing so, I had found a measure of peace for my own tortured spirit. Now, whenever I travel through those parts of Mississippi and catch a glimpse of a weathered monument, or hear the distant, echoing clang of metal, I am reminded of that fateful night. I remember the rusted sentinel, whose silent plea for redemption mirrored my own, and I know that sometimes the path to forgiveness lies in facing the darkness, both outside and within. I continue my journey with a renewed sense of purpose, carrying the lessons of that stormy night with me. That redemption is not granted easily, but must be earned through the courage to confront one's deepest regrets and, finally, to let go. My name is Ryan. I'm 28 years old. This happened in the late fall of 2024, when I was desperate to escape the crushing weight of my past. A past filled with a broken relationship, a collapsed career, and a mistake that has haunted me for years. I loaded up my aging RV, a relic that had seen better days and had never quite earned my trust, and set off for the pine forest near Corinth, Mississippi. I needed solitude, a place far removed from the memories that continually reminded me of my failures, and perhaps a chance at redemption. The drive was long and lonesome. The autumn wind whipped through the tall pines, their skeletal branches stripped bare by the season's harshness. I found a clearing near an old, crumbling monument, a forgotten memorial dedicated to a soldier lost during the Civil War. The monument itself was a relic of another time, its once proud inscription now faded and nearly illegible. I parked my RV nearby, its engine coughing intermittently as if protesting the journey, and began to set up camp. The isolation was immediate and profound. It was as if the forest, with its relentless wind and driving rain, was determined to swallow me whole. I had hoped that the solitude would help me sort through the jumble of regret and self-doubt that had consumed me. Instead, the first night brought its own kind of torment. Around midnight, as I sat inside the RV trying to warm myself with a weak, flickering lamp, I began to hear something that wasn't the normal creak of an old vehicle or the howl of the wind. It was a deep, resonant clanging, a metallic sound that echoed like the measured march of unseen footsteps. At first, I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the wind or the groans of my temperamental RV, but the sound persisted, growing steadily louder, as if it were drawing nearer. The following evening, while working outside on a minor repair, trying to coax the engine into some semblance of reliability, I caught sight of something in the periphery of my vision. In the dim light of dusk, among the towering pines, I saw a tall, shadowy figure moving slowly between the trees. The figure was unmistakably human in shape, yet there was something otherworldly about it. As I strained my eyes, I noticed that the person was clad in what looked like a tattered military uniform, its surface mottled with rust and decay. The figure was wearing a dented helmet that obscured its face, and its eyes, if they could be called that, glimmered with a sorrowful, eerie light. Before I could fully comprehend what I was seeing, the figure melted away into the darkness, leaving me with a chill that seeped deep into my bones. Disturbed, I wandered over to the old monument the next day. The ground around it was littered with remnants of personal effects: a rusted locket, a battered pocket watch, and faded inscriptions that hinted at a tragic story. I pressed my hand against the cold metal of the monument, feeling as though I were coming into contact with a piece of history laden with unspoken regrets. An inscription, almost eroded beyond recognition, spoke of a soldier condemned to wander these lands after a fatal mistake on the battlefield, a mistake that not only cost him his life, but left him burdened with unending remorse. The words, though fragmented, resonated with something deep inside me. For reasons I couldn't fully explain, I felt an inexplicable kinship with this long-dead soldier, as if his story mirrored my own inner torment. As night fell over the forest in the following days, the eerie phenomena escalated. My RV's electrical system began to fail more frequently, plunging me into sporadic darkness punctuated by the intermittent, eerie clanging I'd grown to dread. At times, I would wake up to discover personal items inexplicably moved from their usual places, and on more than one occasion, I experienced sudden drafts of cold air that swept through the cramped interior of the RV. In those moments, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone, that something unseen was observing my every move. Tormented by both the relentless weather and the supernatural occurrences, I turned to local history for solace. I spent hours in a small-town library when I could get reliable internet, poring over old records and newspaper clippings about Corinth and its surrounding areas. I discovered that the region had seen its share of tragedy during the Civil War, a battle so fierce and fraught with error that many local legends were born from its ashes. Among these stories was that of a soldier known as the Rusted Sentinel. According to local lore, this man had made a catastrophic error on the battlefield that cost not only his life, but also the lives of several comrades. His punishment, it was said, was eternal unrest. He was doomed to wander the pine forests, forever searching for a way to atone for his mistake. Each time I read these accounts, my internal guilt and regret deepened. I couldn't help but see parallels between his story and my own. A past mistake, a life marred by regret, and the desperate longing for redemption. It was as if the Rusted Sentinel's wandering spirit had been waiting for someone like me, a fellow soul burdened with remorse, to acknowledge his suffering and, perhaps, help him find peace. Night after night, the spectral soldier's presence became increasingly apparent. I began to experience vivid nightmares, filled with the sounds of clashing steel, the anguished cries of dying men, and disembodied military commands echoing in the howling wind. In the waking hours, I would find myself inexplicably drawn to the edge of the forest, as if some invisible force was guiding me toward a destination I was meant to confront. Objects inside the RV, a pen here, a notebook there, would vanish only to reappear in odd places, almost as if the Rusted Sentinel himself were leaving clues, guiding me deeper into his tragic history. Then, on one particularly stormy night, when the rain pounded the earth with relentless fury and the wind howled like the voices of the damned, I felt a compulsion I could no longer ignore. I gathered my notebook, a few candles, and the remnants of my scant belongings, and stepped out into the tempest. The RV's lights flickered erratically, casting long, distorted shadows across the drenched forest floor. I followed the sound of that relentless clanging, a sound that now seemed more like a summons than a threat, until I reached a secluded clearing deep in the forest. There, nestled beneath overgrown brush and tangled roots, lay a crumbling memorial that bore the scars of time. Its surface was etched with weathered inscriptions, and the air around it was heavy with a palpable sorrow. In the center of the clearing, partially concealed by debris, I discovered a rusted box. My hands trembled as I pried it open, revealing its contents. Among them were the very relics I had seen scattered near the monument: a rusted locket and a battered pocket watch, and a fragment of a journal. The journal fragment was a hastily scrawled account of a final regret, detailing the soldier's remorse and the wish that his lost honor might be restored through a simple act of restitution. The words resonated with a clarity that sent shivers down my spine. It was as though the spirit of the rusted sentinel had reached out through the decades to implore someone, anyone, to help him find closure. In that charged moment, as the storm raged around me and the relentless clanging of metal filled the air, I felt my own inner turmoil come to a head. I knelt by the memorial, clutching the relics tightly, and spoke aloud my own confession. A torrent of regrets, of mistakes made and chances lost. I acknowledged the burden I had carried for so long, and in doing so I vowed to honor the memory of the soldier whose suffering had somehow mirrored my own. My voice, though shaking, carried across the clearing, mingling with the patter of rain and the mournful whisper of the wind. As I finished speaking, the atmosphere shifted. The oppressive chill that had haunted me all night began to lift, and for a brief, transcendent moment, I felt a profound sense of relief, as if a weight I had borne for years was finally being lifted. Then, emerging from the swirling rain and shadows, I saw him one final time. The rusted sentinel stood before me, his spectral form illuminated by the occasional flash of lightning. His eyes, hidden beneath the dented helmet, shone with a sorrow so deep that I felt it pierce my soul. For a few long, suspended seconds we regarded each other in silence, a meeting of two tortured souls bound by the shared burden of regret. Without a word, I placed the rusted locket and the journal fragment at the base of the memorial, as if returning them to their rightful resting place. The soldier's gaze softened, and his form began to shimmer with a gentle, sorrowful glow. Slowly, as though carried away by the very wind that had borne the voices of the past, the rusted sentinel began to dissolve into the darkness. The last thing I saw was the faint outline of his uniform, fading like the remnants of a long-forgotten dream, before he vanished completely, leaving behind a silence that felt almost sacred. In the aftermath of that night, the storms eventually subsided, and the forest fell into a heavy, reflective quiet. I returned to my RV, feeling as if I'd crossed a threshold, a passage from despair into a tentative hope of redemption. The supernatural occurrences lessened, and the oppressive presence that had haunted me for so long seemed to recede into the shadows of memory. I kept the relics safely in my notebook as a reminder of what had transpired, a testament to the idea that sometimes the ghosts we face are not just specters from the past, but reflections of our own inner demons. Driving away from the forest the next day, I felt an unfamiliar lightness in my heart. I knew that the scars of my past would not vanish overnight, but in that storm-lashed clearing, I had taken the first step toward forgiving myself. I had confronted a ghost, a haunted soul condemned to wander in eternal regret, and in doing so, I had found a measure of peace for my own tortured spirit. Now, whenever I travel through those parts of Mississippi and catch a glimpse of a weathered monument, or hear the distant, echoing clang of metal, I am reminded of that fateful night. I remember the rusted sentinel, whose silent plea for redemption mirrored my own, and I know that sometimes the path to forgiveness lies in facing the darkness, both outside and within. I continue my journey with a renewed sense of purpose, carrying the lessons of that stormy night with me. That redemption is not granted easily, but must be earned through the courage to confront one's deepest regrets and, finally, to let go. My name is Donovan Blake. I am 35 years old. This happened in the late fall of 2024, when I decided that a break from the chaos of urban life and the sting of professional setbacks was overdue. As a nature documentarian with a deep passion for technology, I believed that my state-of-the-art equipment could capture the most elusive secrets of the wild, and perhaps restore my reputation after critics dismissed my unconventional methods. With that determination in mind, I loaded my high-tech RV, my mobile laboratory filled with cutting-edge cameras, drones, and audio recorders, and drove deep into the remote, fog-shrouded pine woods of central Mississippi. The area was isolated, where modern roads gave way to ancient trees and long-forgotten homesteads. The late autumn air was crisp and filled with an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional droning whisper of wind through the pines. The drive itself was a mix of determination and defiance. I left behind the familiar hum of city life, confident that my equipment would record phenomena that defied logic. Yet, as soon as I arrived, I began to sense that nature here was indifferent to human contrivance. I set up camp near an abandoned farmhouse rumored to be steeped in strange occurrences, parking my RV on a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The woods were dense, and a thick, low-hanging fog blurred the edges of reality. I felt both excited and oddly unnerved. My skepticism of local folklore was strong, but the environment had a way of challenging even the most rational mind. That first night, as darkness swallowed the forest and my RV's interior glowed with the soft light of a few well-placed LEDs, I powered up my recording equipment. I intended to document every sound and image, convinced that any anomaly would be captured in high resolution by my cameras and sensors. As midnight approached, I noticed a low, rhythmic scraping sound that I initially dismissed as a mechanical quirk or the shifting of old metal in the wind. But the sound was too deliberate, a metallic clatter that resembled the dragging of a heavy chain across the forest floor. I checked my audio recorder and, sure enough, it had picked up the sound clearly, its waveform a steady pulse in the silence. The next morning, after a restless sleep filled with dreams of shadowy figures and whispering winds, I reviewed the recordings. The video footage from my stationary cameras showed fleeting glimpses of indistinct shapes at the periphery of the frame, and one of the drones I'd deployed had inexplicably crashed in the dense forest, its recovered footage marred by strange static and erratic interference. My confidence in my technological tools began to waver as I noticed that my GPS kept recalculating in odd loops, and power fluctuations intermittently darkened the interior of my RV. I attributed these issues to the age of my vehicle and the unpredictable nature of the remote environment, yet a nagging feeling told me that something else was at play. Over the next few nights, the anomalies escalated. The relentless metallic scraping sound grew steadily louder, echoing each night right at the stroke of midnight. My cameras, which had previously shown only vague, indistinct images, began to capture fleeting figures moving within the dense fog. In one recording, the drone's camera picked up an area where the fog swirled unnaturally, almost forming shapes that were distinctly humanoid before dissipating into the mist. I ventured out one evening to inspect the perimeter of my campsite, and that's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Deep gouges were carved into the rough bark of the ancient pines surrounding me. Deliberate, jagged marks arranged in a pattern that suggested ritualistic intent. As I traced one of the gouges with a trembling finger, I spotted something half buried in the moss and dirt near the edge of my RV's parking area. It was an old, rusted tool, shaped like a sickle and etched with strange, almost primitive symbols. The sight of that relic, so out of place in this modern world, sent a shiver down my spine. I had always prided myself on my belief in technology and the power of modern science to unveil nature's secrets. Yet, as I continued to review my recordings, my certainty began to crumble. Every night, the static-filled images and ghostly silhouettes on my cameras became more distinct. At precisely midnight, I started to catch a glimpse of a spectral figure lurking in the fog, a gaunt, shadowy presence that seemed to drift in and out of focus. The figure wore tattered, dark clothing that merged with the surrounding darkness, and in one brief, terrifying moment, I saw it wield an oversized, rusted sickle that glowed faintly under the moonlight. The sight was as inexplicable as it was chilling, and it left me questioning everything I had ever believed about the power of technology. Local lore, which I had previously dismissed as mere superstition, suddenly began to take on a new significance. Whispers among the few locals in nearby towns spoke of a figure known as the Midnight Harvester, a spectral entity, once a proud farmer whose unchecked greed and hubris had led him to exploit the land ruthlessly. According to the legend, his actions had ruined his community, and as nature's retribution, he had been cursed to roam these pine woods for eternity. Instead of reaping crops, he now reaped the souls of those who disturbed his domain. A grim reminder that some forces in nature are best left undisturbed. With each passing night, the presence of the Midnight Harvester became undeniable. My equipment, once the symbol of my unwavering confidence, now seemed powerless in the face of this ancient force. The high-tech cameras captured inexplicable images, a flicker of a gaunt figure here, the persistent echo of a scraping sound there. I found myself growing increasingly paranoid, my rational mind battered by a relentless barrage of supernatural evidence. I questioned whether my technological arrogance had blinded me to a reality that predated our modern inventions, a reality where nature's mysteries could not be tamed by science. Then, on a particularly stormy night when the sky was a tumult of dark, swirling clouds, and the forest was shrouded in an almost impenetrable fog, I reached a breaking point. My devices were acting erratically. The recordings were now dominated by a constant, unnerving metallic clatter, and my entire being was gripped by a sense of impending doom. Driven by a mix of terror and a desperate need to prove that my work mattered, I decided to venture out of the relative safety of my RV. I donned a heavy jacket and stepped into the storm, my heart pounding as the cold rain dripped from the branches overhead. I followed the sound of the scraping, which seemed to echo from deeper within the woods, guiding me toward an unknown destination. The forest was eerily silent except for the relentless noise, a sound that was at once mechanical and otherworldly. The fog swirled thickly around me, turning the world into a shifting, indistinct mass of gray and shadow. After what felt like an eternity of navigating through the oppressive darkness, I came upon a clearing. In the ghostly half-light, where the fog swirled into an almost tangible barrier, I saw him, the Midnight Harvester. He stood at the center of the clearing, a spectral figure whose very presence seemed to command the silence. His form was gaunt and ragged, draped in tattered clothing that merged with the night. What struck me most was the enormous, rusted sickle he clutched in his bony hand. It glowed faintly in the dim light, as if imbued with an ancient, sorrowful energy. His eyes, empty, hollow, yet burning with an unending intensity, met mine across the distance. In that frozen moment, the sound of the scraping grew deafening, and the wind carried with it an almost palpable aura of despair. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as if time itself had stilled. In that silent, wordless confrontation, I felt my modern arrogance crumble. Here was an entity that had existed long before my gadgets and cameras, an embodiment of nature's raw, ineffable power that defied all my technological prowess. I could no longer rely solely on my recordings or my instruments. I had to confront the truth with my own eyes and heart. The harvester's gaze held me captive, and for several agonizing seconds we simply observed one another. It was as if he was measuring my worth, silently communicating that my relentless pursuit of proof had awakened something ancient and unyielding. My mind raced with thoughts of the local legends, of a proud farmer turned cursed specter doomed to reap what he once sowed. I realized then that my work, my obsession with capturing the extraordinary, had inadvertently roused a force that I was woefully unprepared to handle. In that charged moment, as the storm roared around us and the fog swirled with an almost sentient force, I felt a profound humility wash over me, a realization that no matter how advanced my technology, there were mysteries in nature that transcended human control. The Midnight Harvester did not speak a word. His silent presence was enough. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, his form began to fade into the swirling mists. The scraping sound softened and eventually dissipated, leaving behind an eerie, resonant silence that echoed the enormity of what I had just experienced. I stood alone in that clearing for a long time, the storm gradually subsiding and the oppressive fog thinning. With trembling hands and a mind forever altered, I returned to my RV. My equipment, once the pride of my modern ambitions, now lay silent and useless in the aftermath of the encounter. I reviewed the recordings on my laptop later, and although they contained fragmented images and static-laden sounds, nothing could capture the visceral reality of standing face to face with that spectral figure. I left the woods the following morning with my gear packed and a new understanding etched into my soul. My recordings, a mix of modern technology and inexplicable images, served as a humbling reminder that some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious. I had set out to prove that nature could be tamed by science, only to learn that there are forces in the wild that have existed long before our modern inventions, and that my arrogance had blinded me to their power. Driving away from the remote pine woods, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a mixture of awe and humility replacing the hubris that had once defined me. I had encountered the Midnight Harvester, an ancient force born of nature's raw and inscrutable power, and in doing so, I had been forced to confront my own limitations. I now understand that there are things in this world that defy explanation, no matter how advanced our tools or how steadfast our beliefs. My name is Donovan Blake, and while I still use technology to explore the natural world, I now do so with a newfound respect for the mysteries that lie beyond our control. The encounter with the Midnight Harvester remains etched in my memory as a stark lesson in humility, a reminder that nature's secrets are not ours to conquer, but to honor and sometimes to fear. My name is Ethan Price. I am 37 years old. This happened in the late winter of 2024, when I decided that I could no longer bear the weight of my past. I was a freelance photographer and former history professor, driven from academia by the crushing grief of losing someone I loved more than life itself. In search of solace and perhaps a fresh beginning, I rented an aging RV and headed deep into the remote pine woods of central Mississippi. I craved isolation, a quiet place where the stark, snow-dusted landscape might help me capture nature's raw beauty on film and, in the process, piece together my fractured heart. The drive out was long and lonely, the roads winding through endless stands of pines whose dark silhouettes contrasted sharply with a sky heavy with winter clouds. By the time I arrived, the woods were blanketed in a thick layer of snow, and an almost surreal silence had settled over the landscape. I parked my RV in a small clearing near a stand of ancient pines. The cold was biting, and a dense fog clung to the ground, blurring the line between the present and something far older. I set up my little mobile studio with a mix of hope and trepidation, determined to document every detail. The first few days passed in a sort of quiet routine. I roamed the woods during the day, snapping photos of frozen branches, crystalline icicles, and the haunting beauty of nature in winter. But at night, strange anomalies began to disturb the fragile peace. My RV, usually a dependable haven, started acting erratically. Power outages would plunge me into darkness without warning, and my cameras, devices I had trusted implicitly, began exhibiting odd behavior. The digital clock on one of my cameras would reset unexpectedly, and photos taken under the cover of night sometimes revealed scenes that didn't match what I remembered. A cobblestone street bathed in lamplight. A blurred figure in old-fashioned clothing standing just at the edge of the frame. One night, as I sat by the weak glow of a desk lamp, I heard something that made my heart race. At exactly midnight, amid the whisper of wind through the pines and the low murmur of my failing RV heater, there came a faint, distant chime. It was the sound of an old clock, a slow, deliberate toll that seemed utterly out of place in these silent woods. I paused, straining to listen. The sound was soft yet persistent, echoing in the stillness as if it were calling from another time. The following morning, after a night of fitful sleep filled with disjointed dreams and half-remembered images, I decided to review the photos from the night. I was startled to discover that several images captured an indistinct, shadowy figure in period attire. A man, dressed as if he belonged to the early 20th century, standing just beyond the flickering perimeter of my RV's light. In one photo, the figure's face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and a somber expression, as if he were burdened by sorrow. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light or a malfunction in my camera's sensor, but the image was too clear, too consistent. Later that day, while checking around the RV, I noticed something half buried in the snow near the back. With gloved hands, trembling in the cold, I unearthed an antique pocket watch. Its case was intricately designed, with faded engravings hinting at a bygone era, and the watch's hands were moving, strangely moving backwards. A chill ran through me as I picked it up. It was as if the watch carried with it the sorrow of a long-forgotten past. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was caught in a web where memory, time, and reality were intermingling. The landscape itself seemed to pulse with an undercurrent of unease. On subsequent nights, the anomalies intensified. Not only did my equipment continue to glitch, clocks resetting, images capturing ghostly figures, and power outages striking at the most inopportune moments, but I also began to experience disorienting lapses in time. There were moments when I'd look up from my work and realize that hours had slipped by unnoticed, that the once reliable cadence of time was now erratic and uncertain. Driven by a need for answers, I spent the daylight hours scouring local archives in a nearby town when the RV's connection allowed. I pored over old newspapers, journals, and faded photographs, trying to piece together a local history that might explain the disturbances I was witnessing. I learned of a tragic incident at an abandoned homestead not far from where I was staying. A story of a man who had lost his family in a sudden, devastating disaster decades ago. According to the fragments I uncovered, this man was said to have been doomed by his grief. He wandered the woods for years, clutching an ornate pocket watch, desperate to reclaim a moment that had been lost forever. The locals referred to him in hushed tones as the time wraith, a spectral figure whose presence was a reminder that the past, no matter how painful, should remain where it belongs. That revelation sent a shiver down my spine. Each time I looked at the antique pocket watch in my hand, I felt the weight of that unresolved sorrow. The more I learned, the more I saw a parallel between the legend of the time wraith and my own internal struggle. I had been clinging desperately to memories of a love lost, of moments I could never recapture, and in doing so, I had allowed my grief to warp my perception of the present. Then came the night that changed everything. It was around 2:00 a.m., what some locals had called the lost hour, when time itself seemed to falter, and I was unable to sleep. The chill in the RV was biting, and the silence outside was broken only by the soft, repetitive chime of that inexplicable old clock. I sat by the window, staring out into the fog-laden darkness, my thoughts adrift in memories and regrets. And then, as if summoned by my own internal despair, I saw him. Emerging from the dense, swirling fog among the pines was the time wraith. He appeared exactly as the fragments in my photos had suggested. A spectral man in early 20th century attire, his face a mask of profound sorrow, his eyes deep, empty voids that seemed to carry the weight of endless regret. In his hand, he clutched an ornate pocket watch, much like the one I had found, its hands ticking backwards in slow, mournful rhythm. The apparition drifted silently, as if floating on the edge of time, and for a moment I felt an overwhelming compulsion to reach out, to understand the agony that haunted him. I stepped out of the RV, my breath visible in the cold night air, and followed him as he moved deeper into the woods. The fog swallowed him up, and for a few heartbeats I lost sight of him entirely. Then, as if guiding me through the labyrinth of memories and lost time, the time wraith reappeared, standing before an old, dilapidated homestead. Its broken clock tower, barely visible through the mist, seemed to echo the steady tolling of a clock that was not meant to exist in the modern world. The sight of that forlorn structure, with its weathered timbers and shattered windows, stirred something deep within me. I felt as though I were standing at the threshold of a long-forgotten past, a past that I had been unwilling to let go of, and that now beckoned me to confront it head-on. With trembling resolve, I entered the homestead, my footsteps echoing in the silence of a place suspended between memory and oblivion. Inside, the air was heavy with decay and regret. Dust motes danced in the pale light that filtered through broken panes, and every creak of the old wood seemed to whisper secrets of loss. In the center of the main room stood a grand clock that had long since stopped, its hands frozen at a moment that might have been the pinnacle of sorrow and joy combined. As I approached, I noticed that the clock's face bore a strange inscription, and its glass was fogged over, as if preserving the secrets of a bygone era. In that surreal moment, the time wraith materialized before me once again. His eyes met mine, and in them I saw a torrent of memories, not just his, but reflections of my own. I was flooded with images of happier times, of a love that I had lost, and a future that had been shattered by grief. The boundaries between his memories and my own blurred, and for a heart-stopping moment I could no longer tell where his sorrow ended and mine began. Tears welled in my eyes as I realized the truth. My desperate clinging to the past had trapped me in an endless cycle of regret and sorrow. I had been so unwilling to let go of my memories that I had allowed them to distort my present, to warp the fabric of time around me. The time wraith was not merely a ghost from local legend. He was the embodiment of all that I had refused to release. In that charged moment of confrontation, I spoke softly into the silence, my voice trembling with raw emotion. "I'm sorry," I whispered, "not just for him, but for myself as well. I've held on for too long. I can't keep living in this lost hour." My words, laden with the weight of years of grief, seemed to hang in the air, mingling with the spectral mist. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened except the sound of my own ragged breathing and the faint, echoing chime of a clock from another time. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the time wraith's form began to soften. His hollow eyes, once filled with endless despair, lost some of their sorrow, and the ornate pocket watch in his hand slowed its backward march. As I stood there, I felt as though a great burden were lifting. a gentle release of all the pain I had carried for so long. In that final, bittersweet instant, the time wraith faded away, dissolving into the cold winter air like mist under the morning sun. The temporal distortions that had plagued the night, those strange lapses in time and the ghostly images captured by my camera, began to subside. The oppressive chill of the lost hour gave way to the steady, familiar rhythm of time moving forward. I returned to my RV with a heart heavy yet strangely lightened by what had transpired. My camera, still filled with haunting images of that spectral encounter, now served as a reminder of the fragile interplay between memory and time. I knew that I would always carry the ache of loss, but I had finally learned that the past, no matter how painful, must remain where it belongs. Leaving the woods the following morning, I felt a sense of catharsis that I had not known in years. I drove away with a bittersweet resolve, determined to rebuild my life without being shackled by the ghosts of what once was. My work as a photographer would continue, but now I carried with me the hard-won lesson that true healing requires letting go. The time wraith, the spectral keeper of lost moments, had shown me that clinging to memories can trap us in an endless loop of sorrow. Only by releasing them can we allow the present and the future to take shape. My name is Ethan Price, and while the fragile echoes of the past will always whisper in my heart, I now know that the only way to move forward is to allow time to flow unbound. The encounter in those snow-dusted pine woods taught me that our memories, however dear, must remain in their rightful place in the past so that we might embrace the possibilities of tomorrow. My name is Jared Monroe. I am 42 years old. This happened in early summer 2024, when I finally decided to leave behind the ruins of my past. A failed band, a lost love, and years of drifting aimlessly, and seek solace in the untamed wilds near Meridian, Mississippi. I loaded up my aging RV, my trusty albeit temperamental mobile refuge, and drove deep into a dense pine forest where modern roads faded into tangled ancient woods. I hoped that isolation and nature's raw beauty would help me reconnect with my creative spirit and, perhaps, capture something extraordinary on film. The drive was long and lonesome. I remember watching the landscape change as the pavement gave way to gravel and then to dirt tracks flanked by towering pines whose dark silhouettes blurred into the early evening fog. Arriving at my chosen clearing, I set up camp with a mix of cautious optimism and lingering melancholy. The forest was alive with sounds. The distant call of cicadas, the whisper of wind through the needles. And yet, there was a pervasive stillness that hinted at secrets hidden within its depths. During the first couple of nights, I settled into a quiet routine. I'd wake with the pale light of dawn, wander the woods with my camera in hand, and return to the RV to develop my film in the dim glow of a portable lamp. My equipment, cameras, audio recorders, and various technical gadgets I'd painstakingly assembled over the years had always been my trusted tools, evidence of my analytical mind and love for detail. But almost immediately, subtle anomalies began to manifest. It started with minor glitches, a faint static in my audio logs, and photographs that, upon careful review, occasionally displayed vague blurred shapes at the edge of the frame. I initially chalked these up to equipment quirks or tricks of the low light filtering through the forest canopy. However, on the third night, as the humid darkness pressed in, I distinctly heard something that I couldn't ignore. At exactly midnight, amidst the chorus of nocturnal insects and the rustle of leaves, a melody, a strange, otherworldly tune, drifted on the air. It was played on what sounded like a wind instrument. The notes at once achingly beautiful and heartbreakingly mournful, I sat frozen in the RV, straining to catch every note as the sound wove its way through the pines. The next morning, I reviewed my recordings with a mounting sense of unease. The audio captured the faint melody in its entirety, perfectly synchronized to the moment I had heard it. I even found a few photos where, in the periphery of the frame, a shadowy figure seemed to materialize. A man, perhaps, clothed in ragged, outdated garments that suggested a time long past. I tried to remain rational, convincing myself that fatigue and the forest's natural acoustics were playing tricks on me. Yet, something in that melody, the raw sadness in its cadence, spoke directly to me, stirring memories of lost dreams and a love that had once set my heart ablaze. Over the next several nights, the phenomenon intensified. Each midnight, the ethereal tune grew clearer, its notes more insistent, as if calling out to me from a distant, forgotten era. Alongside the auditory disturbances, I began to notice other inexplicable details. Near the RV, half buried in the damp earth and scattered pine needles, lay a broken antique flute. Its metal was tarnished by time and neglect, and despite its disrepair, the instrument seemed imbued with an uncanny presence. I couldn't shake the feeling that this relic was somehow connected to the melody I kept hearing, a relic of a story I was meant to unravel. As the nights passed, my internal conflict deepened. Memories of my lost band and the love I had once cherished surged unbidden into my thoughts. I had always clung to those memories, desperately trying to recapture the magic of a time when music and passion had defined me. Now, as the spectral tune echoed through the humid night air, I found myself torn between the rational part of me, dismissing it as a technical anomaly or an overactive imagination fueled by grief, and the part that longed to believe in the beauty of something beyond explanation. One humid night, driven by both professional curiosity and a personal need to confront my own ghosts, I decided to follow the sound. I packed a small flashlight and left the relative safety of the RV, drawn into the forest by that unearthly melody. The dense fog and the heavy, humid air made navigation difficult. Every step seemed to lead me deeper into a labyrinth of ancient pines and twisting undergrowth. The sound of the music grew louder and more insistent as I advanced, its notes mingling with the natural sounds of the forest to create a haunting, almost hypnotic atmosphere. Then, in a moonlit clearing shrouded in swirling fog, I saw him, the ragged piper. He stood alone amidst the trees, a spectral figure whose appearance was as startling as it was sorrowful. His clothes were ragged and worn, remnants of a bygone era that looked as if they had been scavenged from the ruins of a forgotten past. In his bony, outstretched hand, he held a strange wind instrument that looked like a cross between a set of bagpipes and an elongated, eerie flute. As he played, the notes he produced were both beautiful and laced with an unbearable melancholy, a sound that seemed to echo the pain of every lost dream and every love that slipped away. For a long, suspended moment, time seemed to stand still. I stood there, hidden behind a clump of ferns, my heart pounding in my ears. The piper's eyes, hollow yet profoundly sad, locked with mine, and in that gaze I felt an immense sorrow, as if he were burdened by the weight of centuries of regret. I wanted to call out, to ask him who he was, or why he played such a mournful tune, but words failed me. Instead, I could only watch as the spectral musician continued his lament, his music weaving an invisible thread that tugged at the deepest parts of my soul. As I reluctantly backed away from the clearing, the haunting melody gradually faded into the night. I returned to my RV, my mind swirling with questions and an aching sense of loss that was not entirely my own. In the days that followed, I scoured my recordings and photographs. The evidence of that encounter was undeniable. My camera had captured fleeting images of the Piper's gaunt figure at the edge of the frame, and my audio logs preserved the mournful notes that had so captivated me. Strange objects began to appear around my campsite. A scrap of tattered fabric here, a broken piece of antique metal there, each item a subtle reminder of that surreal encounter. Back in the quiet solitude of my RV, I wrestled with the implications of what I had experienced. Was the Ragged Piper a mere ghost of local folklore? A once renowned musician driven to ruin by personal tragedy, cursed to wander the forest for all eternity? Or was he a manifestation of my own unresolved grief and obsession? An echo of a past I was unwilling to let go. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that his spectral presence was a mirror reflecting my inner turmoil. His music, haunting in its beauty, was a lament not only for his lost glory, but for the parts of myself I had clung to for far too long. One humid, stifling night, unable to bear the pull of the past any longer, I made a decision. I would confront the Ragged Piper directly, and in doing so, confront my own deepest regrets. I left the RV once again, following the unmistakable sound of his melody as it drifted through the trees. The forest was thick with fog, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine resin, and every step felt like a journey back in time. I reached the same moonlit clearing where I had first seen him, and there he was, standing as though expecting me, his instrument cradled in his bony hands, his sorrowful eyes fixed on me. In that charged silence, with only the distant call of a night bird and the soft rustling of leaves for company, I stepped forward. My voice, trembling with emotion, broke the stillness. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my words nearly lost in the mournful strains of his melody. For a long moment he said nothing, his eyes deep pools of regret and longing. Then, almost imperceptibly, his tune softened as if in response. I felt a rush of emotion, a mingling of my own pain with an ancient sorrow that transcended time. In that surreal exchange, I understood that the Ragged Piper was more than just a ghost of a lost musician. He was the embodiment of all the beauty and despair of a past that I had refused to let go of. His music was not meant to lure me into eternal nostalgia, but to warn me that clinging too tightly to what is lost can trap one in an endless cycle of grief. My fixation on recapturing a moment that was gone had blinded me to the present, and his mournful melody was urging me to let go. With tears welling in my eyes, I turned away from the Piper, my heart heavy but resolute. I slowly retraced my steps back to the RV, leaving the clearing and its sorrowful guardian behind. In the days that followed, I reviewed my recordings and photographs with a newfound clarity. The spectral images and haunting audio were undeniable evidence of my encounter. Yet they also served as a painful reminder of the price of obsession. I knew then that I had to free myself from the chains of the past if I ever hoped to move forward. I packed up my gear and left the forest with a bittersweet sense of catharsis. The Ragged Piper's melody continued to echo faintly in my dreams, a lingering refrain of what had been and what could no longer be reclaimed. Yet, as I drove away in my worn RV, I felt a renewed resolve to honor my memories without letting them define me. I realized that while the beauty of the past is captivating, it is only a part of who we are, and that the future, however uncertain, holds the promise of new beginnings. My name is Jared Monroe, and while the song of the past will always haunt my heart, I now know that I must live in the present. The encounter with the Ragged Piper taught me that true art and healing come not from a desperate clinging to what's lost, but from embracing the fragile beauty of today while respectfully letting go of yesterday. As I continue my journey, I carry with me the memory of that haunting melody, a reminder of both the lure and the peril of obsession, and a quiet promise to forge a future unburdened by the ghosts of the past.